Dust exploded under Caleb Mercer's boots as he cut the rope from a wounded stallion thrashing beside the saloon hitching post. The horse's eyes burned wild. Caleb's left hand trembled, the pale scar where a wedding ring once lived catching the lantern light. Then the brand showed beneath the blood. Apache. The crowd went quiet. A small Apache boy stepped from the alley shadows and whispered, "That horse belongs to my father." Caleb looked from the child to the ridge beyond town, because returning that horse was about to bring 300 warriors to his gate at dawn. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Dust exploded under Caleb Mercer's boots as he cut the rope from the wounded stallion thrashing beside the saloon hitching post. The animal struck sparks from the hard street with its iron shoes, nostrils red with pain, flanks dark with sweat and blood. Men backed away from the flying hooves. A lantern swung above the saloon door, throwing long yellow bands over the horse's neck, over Caleb's bent shoulders, over the left hand that trembled when he worked the knife. The pale scar where a wedding ring once lived flashed in the light like a ghost of another life. Then the brand showed beneath the blood. Apache. The laughter on the porch died all at once. A small Apache boy stepped from the alley shadows with his chest rising hard and fast, dust on his bare feet, fear and hope mixed in his eyes. "That horse belongs to my father," he whispered. Caleb straightened slowly. The knife stayed low in his hand. Across the street the men who had been drinking stood very still, and behind their stillness he felt the old thing that ruined valleys and grave and whole families. Fear first, then pride, then blood. The stallion tried to rear again and nearly collapsed. Caleb caught the lead rope and spoke low, not to calm the horse so much as to keep his own anger from spilling over. "Who did this?" No one answered. One of the men on the porch, Lute Vanner, tipped his chair back and spat into the dust. He was big through the shoulders, a cattleman's son grown mean with whiskey and easy power. A strip of red cloth was tied around his hatband, and his right cheek carried an old knife mark that pulled when he smiled. "It's a horse," Lute said. "Don't make it into scripture." Caleb looked at the wound cut into the stallion's flank where someone had tried to alter the brand with a hot iron and poor skill. He looked at the boy. He looked at the men pretending not to watch. It was stolen. Lute shrugged, found straying. "In town?" Caleb asked. A few men laughed, thin laughter, nervous. The boy stepped closer to the horse, though his hands shook. "His name is Storm Runner." Lute's smile widened. "Hear that? Beast's got a noble name." Caleb said nothing. He was remembering other nights, other men with bottles, other things called straying that ended with widows. He was remembering his wife, Anna, lying still beneath a quilt that could not warm her. The ring loose on her finger after fever took all the strength from her hand. He had buried her 3 winters before on the rise behind his cabin, where the sun struck last each evening. Since then he had learned how quickly a house could go silent. How quickly a man could let that silence turn into cowardice and call it peace. The horse stumbled. Caleb caught its head and felt the fever heat through the hide. The boy lifted his chin. Brave, though fear kept working through him like cold. "If my father does not find him, men will ride." That quieted the street more than the gun hanging at the sheriff's hip. Sheriff Bo Harlan had been standing in the saloon doorway for the better part of a minute, hat low, gray mustache stiff with the damp of his drink. He was not a cruel man, not in the simple way, but he was old enough to fear disorder more than injustice, and on the frontier that often amounted to the same thing. "That enough now?" Harlan said. "Take the boy off the street." "No," Caleb said. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "You aiming to tell me my work?" "I'm aiming to keep this town from birthing its own funeral." The sheriff came down the steps with a stiffness in his knees. "What happens between settlers and raiders beyond town ain't all on you." Caleb's gaze never left the horse. "This part is." Lute Vanner stood up. "You accuse me plain if you've got the sand for it." Caleb finally turned. "Did you steal this horse?" Lute's hand drifted near his belt, not to his gun just yet, but to the thought of it. "Careful, Mercer." Men gathered at the edges now, teamsters, store clerks, a blacksmith with soot on both forearms, a preacher who never knew where to put his eyes when violence breathed nearby. Nobody wanted trouble, nobody wanted justice enough to pay for it either. The boy spoke before Lute could answer. "I saw you." His voice wavered once, then steadied. "At the creek 2 nights ago, you and the others. My father was hunting. You took Storm Runner from the trees." Lute barked a laugh. "Hear him, little coyote dreaming." Another man on the porch, younger and duller, said, "Maybe best send the boy along, Lute." Lute rounded on him. "Maybe best you shut your mouth." The stallion's knees buckled. Caleb went down with him, one hand on the neck, one on the rope. The horse shuddered against the ground. Blood seeped dark from the cut brand. A choice settled in Caleb like winter settling into timber. Quiet, hard, final, he rose, walked to the water trough, dipped his hat, and brought water back in both hands to wet the horse's mouth. Then he looked at the boy. "Where's your camp?" The sheriff stepped in front of him. "You will not take that animal out there." Caleb's face stayed still. "Then they'll come here for it." "Let them talk to me." Caleb looked at Harlan, at the tired lines around his eyes, at the badge catching lantern glow. "Will you hand over the men that did this?" Harlan did not answer. That was answer enough. Caleb cut another length of rope from the hitch rail. He made a sling of it and tied it under the horse's belly to keep pressure from the wounded side when it stood. Lute Vanner came off the porch at last, boots hitting dirt hard. "That horse stays town property till morning." "No," Caleb said. "Say it again." Caleb faced him square. He was not as broad as Lute, not as young, but there was iron in the stillness of him. "You want to fight a man for a stolen horse in front of a child and half the town. Do it sober so God can enjoy the honesty." A few men sucked air through their teeth. Harlan muttered, "Lord save us." Lute's hand flashed down. The gun came halfway clear before Caleb's fist struck him under the ear. Lute stumbled sideways into the trough. Water exploded. Another of his men lunged, and Caleb drove the hilt of the knife into the man's ribs hard enough to fold him. The third never reached his gun because Sheriff Harlan finally found his courage and drew first. "That's enough." The old lawman roared, dust hung. The stallion struggled upright with a groan of leather and rope. The little boy clutched the lead line in both hands as if his life were tied to it. Lute wiped blood from his mouth and smiled that knife-pulled smile again. "Worse now, meaner. You ride that horse out, Mercer, and you better not ride back." Caleb looked past him to the dark beyond the town, to the ridges where moonlight silvered stone and cedar. Somewhere out there a father had lost more than a horse. He had lost face before his people, safety for his family, maybe the thing he loved most. If men had done that to Caleb when Anna still lived, he would have crossed hell itself to answer it. He bent toward the boy. "Can the horse travel?" The child nodded quickly, though fear made his teeth chatter. "Can you?" The boy swallowed. "Yes." What's your name?" "Nanton." Caleb nodded once. "All right, Nanton, you walk beside me till we clear town. After that you ride if the horse allows it." Sheriff Harlan lowered his gun an inch. "Mercer, listen to me careful. You step onto Apache ground in the night with stolen property and no flag, and you may as well step into your own grave. Better mine than a town full of others. Don't talk like you're carrying a Bible up a hill. You're carrying trouble." Caleb slid his revolver from his belt and held it out butt first to the sheriff. Harlan stared. "What's this?" "A sign I'm not going to war." Harlan did not take it. "Take it," Caleb said. The sheriff took the revolver slowly. The men on the porch saw that and shifted uneasily. A man willing to ride into danger armed with nothing, but his name was not easy to measure. Men like Lute hated what they could not measure. Caleb handed his rifle over next. Then he turned, gathered the reins, and started leading Storm Runner toward the eastern road. The horse limped, head low but ears alive. Nanton kept close at the animal's shoulder. The town watched them go in a silence that felt less like peace than waiting. At the edge of the street, Harlan called after him. "You bring dawn down on this town, Caleb Mercer, and they'll never forgive you." Caleb did not turn around. "Maybe they shouldn't," he said. They rode beneath a moon thin as a filed blade. The town fell behind. So did the lamps and the false comfort of men talking big on porches. Ahead lay mesquite flats, dry creek beds, and the first long shoulders of the high desert. Caleb had no gun. A sheath knife rode at his hip, useful only for work or close death. Beside him, the wounded stallion breathed in short, hard blasts, each step a labor. Nanton finally mounted bareback after the first mile, sitting lightly so the horse could choose its own gait. The boy rode well, better than many men. For a time they said nothing. Coyotes called from somewhere south. The sound wandered over the land and then was gone. Caleb kept scanning the ridges. No movement. That told him little. Apache scouts could look down from 20 places and leave no sign but a feeling between a man's shoulders. Nanton broke the silence first. "My father is White Hawk." Caleb glanced over. "Chief." The boy nodded. "That changed things, though not in any way that improved the ride. You should have said. You still would have come." Caleb looked forward again. "Yes." The boy seemed to weigh that. Most men in town would not. "No." "Why?" The question traveled deeper than the road. Caleb walked a while before answering. The ground turned stony underfoot. A jackrabbit burst from a brush patch and vanished. "Because if a thing belongs to someone," he said at last, "and you know it, then keeping it rotten sets a man from the inside." Nanton frowned like he was fitting the thought to something larger. "My father says fear makes men steal before hunger does." "Your father's probably right." The boy leaned low over the horse's neck, whispering in Apache. Storm Runner's ears flicked back at the sound, and some of the strain left his body. "How far?" Caleb asked. "Before dawn, if we do not stop." Caleb nodded. The wound bothered him, not his own. The horse's blood had slowed but not ceased. He wished for salve, thread, clean cloth. Wished for 100 things the night refused to provide. They crossed the dry bed of Bitter Creek around midnight. There the first sign appeared. An arrow stood in the sand by the ford, planted upright, fletching white in the moonlight. Not a threat, not yet. A warning. Nanton saw it and drew a breath. They know. Caleb put a hand on the stallion's shoulder and looked slowly into the dark brush above the bank. Nothing moved. "Then let them keep knowing," he said. They climbed out of the creek and entered cedar country where the moon came and went through branches. The smell changed. Dry dust gave way to sap and cold stone. Caleb felt watched now with certainty. The land had gone too quiet. Even insects seemed to hold their breath. He remembered another night years earlier when he and other men had ridden under orders into country that was not theirs. He had been younger then, raw with anger, still carrying the swagger that comes before enough burying teaches a man humility. They had found an empty camp and burned it because someone above them wanted a lesson taught. Caleb still remembered the smell of charred blankets and a child's wooden toy half buried in ash. He had told himself soldiers did what they were told. Later he learned that explanation did not clean a soul any more than smoke cleaned blood. He had not ridden with soldiers since. The trail narrowed into a wash lined by rock walls. Nanton stiffened on the horse. "Stop," the boy whispered. Caleb did. At first he saw nothing. Then one rider appeared on the ridge, then another, then four more, each horse and man cut from shadow. No words, no rush, just presence, the kind that lets a man know the outcome before the first move. Storm Runner snorted and tried to go uphill toward them. Nanton soothed him. A figure rode down alone from the ridge's far side, straight-backed, broad-shouldered, hair bound with a strip of dark cloth. He wore no war paint Caleb could see, only the hard calm of authority. His horse was gray and moved like water over stone. White Hawk. Caleb knew him by reputation and by the way every other rider kept still while he advanced. The chief stopped 10 paces away. His gaze went first to the horse, not to Caleb, not to the boy. To the stallion's wound, the mangled brand, the tired foam at its mouth. Something changed in White Hawk's face then, not softness, something older, deeper. "Nanton," he said. The boy slid down and stepped forward. He spoke rapidly in Apache, one hand on Storm Runner's neck. White Hawk listened without interrupting. When the boy finished, the chief looked at Caleb. "You brought him back." "Yes." "Why?" "Because it was right. Because I was tired of watching men do wrong and call it survival. Because I have buried enough. Because your son looked at me like I still had a chance to be decent." Caleb said only, "He was stolen." White Hawk studied him for several beats. "And the men who stole him?" "In town. Alive." "Yes." That answer seemed to interest the riders on the ridge. One of them shifted his spear and leaned slightly forward. White Hawk dismounted. He walked to Storm Runner and laid a palm on the horse's jaw. The stallion lowered its head at once. "You came without rifle," the chief said. "I came to return what was yours." White Hawk's hand moved to the ruined brand. "Settlers take horses, settlers take land, settlers take children and tell themselves the taking is order." He looked at Caleb. "Why are you different?" Caleb felt the weight of every eye. He could lie, dress himself up, speak like a preacher or a politician. The night would hear the false note. "I'm not different enough," he said, "just enough for this." The riders stayed silent. White Hawk's gaze sharpened. "Not different enough. What does that mean?" Caleb looked at the scar on his own left hand. "It means I have done things I wouldn't defend now." A long moment passed. Then White Hawk nodded once, as if some test no one had named had just begun. He turned and spoke to 2 riders. They came down with blankets, water, and a leather pouch of herbs. One man knelt at Storm Runner's side and began treating the wound with practiced hands. Nanton moved close to his father. White Hawk rested a hand against the boy's hair for the briefest instant. "You knew men would follow the horse," the chief said. "Yes." "You knew they might come killing." "Yes." And still you brought him. Yes. Why? Caleb lifted his eyes to meet the chief's. Because if they came for what was theirs and found I had done nothing, they'd be right to hate every board and soul in that town. One of the younger riders muttered something sharp in Apache. White Hawk silenced him with a glance. The chief motioned toward a flat stone near the wash wall. Sit. Caleb sat, not in comfort, in judgment. The horse was tended. The boy stayed close. White Hawk remained standing for a time, looking east where the first idea of dawn had not yet touched the horizon. At last he said, "There are men among my people who will want the thieves brought out and cut down where they stand. There are old mothers who remember winter hunger and grave. There are young men who see every settler roof as a wound." Caleb said nothing. White Hawk looked at him. "What do your people want?" "Depends which ones you ask." "And you?" Caleb took a slow breath. "I want the stealing to end before it starts a fire neither side can put out." White Hawk crouched, elbows on knees. A man can want peace because he is honorable or because he is afraid. Maybe both. That drew the faintest shadow of approval from the chief's eyes. The riders built no fire. They waited in the dark while Storm Runner was stitched and bound. Caleb sat among them, unarmed, unsure whether he was guest or prisoner. Once Nanton brought him a canteen. Once a rider with a hawk feather in his braid offered dried meat without speaking. No one talked much. The quiet was not empty. It was the kind of quiet in which men weigh lives. Near the hour before dawn, White Hawk stood. "You will ride home now," he said. Caleb rose with him. "Alones." "You came alones." Caleb glanced at the ridges and at the gathering shape of mounted men beyond them. "You're not finished." "No." The single word landed like a gate closing. "What are you going to do?" Caleb asked. White Hawk's face gave nothing away. "A horse was stolen from my son's eyes. Blood was spilled on my animal. The valley will answer. But first," he stepped closer, "first I wanted to see the man who returned what others would have kept." Caleb held his gaze. "Then you've seen him?" White Hawk nodded. "Yes." Nanton came forward and pressed something into Caleb's hand. A small braided strip of rawhide with one white bead worked into it. "For safe trail," the boy said. Caleb curled his fingers around it. He did not know whether the gift promised protection or memory, maybe both. White Hawk mounted the gray horse in one smooth motion. "Ride hard, Caleb Mercer." That was all, no promise, no threat, which was worse. Caleb turned back west just as the first line of dawn silvered the farthest ridge. He had no horse. The chief had not offered one. That too meant something. A man had to return to his own people on his own feet and stand in what he had set in motion. He walked for an hour before he found his ranch pony where a scout had tied it in the cedars. Saddle, canteen, and bedroll all untouched. Another message. They could have taken everything. They had not. He rode hard then. Hard enough that the pony sweated dark before the town road came into view. He did not go into towns. He rode straight past, across the flats, and toward his ranch 2 miles north where a low cabin sat under cottonwoods near a spring. Smoke should have been rising from his chimney by then if the coals still held from the night before. Instead, he saw movement on the eastern hill, then on the southern rise, then to the north. Riders, not 10, not 20. A ring of mounted men and horses, wide and silent and spreading as the light grew. By the time Caleb reached his gate, there were 300 Apache warriors surrounding his ranch. The world seemed to hold still inside that circle. Their horses stood with the patience of storm clouds. Spears and rifles caught dawn in cold lines. No one shouted. No one fired. In some ways, the silence was more terrible than noise. It forced every man looking on to hear his own conscience. And there were townsmen already coming over the flats, half-dressed, rifles in hand, saddle blankets hanging crooked, fear driving them faster than discipline ever would. Sheriff Harlan rode at the front, jaw set hard, 2 deputies on either side. Behind them came Lieutenant Vanner and his brothers, and enough of their hands to ruin a county if foolishness tipped the wrong way. Caleb dismounted at his gate and left the pony standing. White Hawk rode out from the eastern line. At his side came 6 warriors leading 3 bound prisoners on foot. Lute's younger partners from the saloon. Their faces were swollen, their wrists were tied, their hats were gone, one limped badly. The smell of panic drifted off them before they were close enough to hear. The townsmen reined in behind Caleb's fence. Rifles came up. "Hold!" Sheriff Harlan shouted, though his own voice shook. White Hawk raised one hand. 300 riders remained still. He looked down at Caleb. "These men were found in the rocks above our winter water. They carried 2 more saddles cut from stolen horses. They carried silver pieces from traders robbed last month, and a ring taken from the body of an old woman near Red Mesa." Murmurs broke through the settlers. The bound men started babbling at once. "We didn't kill nobody." "Chief, listen. It was Lute's plan." Lieutenant Vanner spurred forward 2 steps and then checked himself when a dozen warriors turned their horses in perfect unison toward him. "You lying curs," he shouted, "don't you put this on me." White Hawk ignored him. His eyes remained on Caleb. "I bring them to you," the chief said, "not because your law is mine, not because your town is clean. I bring them because you returned what was taken. Now I return what was hidden." The meaning spread slowly, then all at once. He was placing judgment in Caleb's hands, not the sheriff's, not the town's, Caleb's. The weight of it landed heavier than any rifle. Sheriff Harlan rode up beside the fence. "Chief White Hawk, if there is complaint to be made, it will be handled by the lawful authority of." White Hawk turned his horse slightly, and whatever the sheriff meant to say went dry in his throat. Caleb stepped forward before fear or pride could speak for anyone else. "What do you want?" he asked. White Hawk's answer came level and clear enough for both peoples to hear. "I want to know whether the man who returned 1 horse has courage enough to return justice too." Lieutenant Vanner cursed under his breath. The bound prisoners sagged like rotten posts. The townsmen looked from Caleb to the chief and back again, each man measuring which side of history he wished to claim and which side of survival. Caleb knew what many expected: quick hanging, a gesture of strength, something public and bloody enough to prove the valley belonged to settlers still. He knew what others feared: that any softness would be read as weakness, and weakness on the frontier could kill more slowly but just as surely. He also knew this: 300 armed riders had not come to beg. They had come to witness. Sheriff Harlan leaned close. "Take custody, put the men in the jail. We can talk after the tribe clears." Lute said loud enough for all, "You turn our own men over to them, Mercer, and you're dead in this valley whether they kill you or not." One of the bound prisoners, face swollen almost shut, cried out. Lute took the horse. Lute took 3 horses. He sold one across the county line. He said no red man would dare come with snow still on the peaks. The valley seemed to tighten. Lute's face blanched, then hardened. "Shut up." Another prisoner shouted over him. "He took the old woman's ring too, said dead hands don't need silver." Sheriff Harlan's head turned slowly toward Lute. "Tell me that isn't true." Lute's eyes moved, not to the sheriff, to the rifles behind him, to the men he thought he still owned with money or fear. That was answer enough too. Caleb felt something old and hot stir in his chest, not for the Apache, for Anna, for all the decent things greed trampled and then joked over, for every time a bully wrapped himself in the language of law while making a mockery of it. He wanted, in that instant, to put his fist or a bullet through Lute Vanner and let the dust drink whatever followed. Maybe White Hawk saw that flicker in him. Maybe Harlan did too. The chief said quietly, "This is the moment that makes a man." Caleb stood between fence and riders and town, between revenge and something harder. He turned first to Sheriff Harlan. "If I hand them to town law, do they hang because they're guilty or because 300 witnesses stand watching?" Harlan swallowed. "Mercer. Do they hang because the law is clean or because the town is frightened?" The sheriff had no easy answer. Caleb turned to White Hawk. "If I hand them to you, what happens?" White Hawk did not flinch from truth. "The horse thieves die. The grave robber dies. The others may die with them, because rage does not always stop where justice ends." That was truth too. Lute suddenly drew. He had been edging his hand closer to the gun all through the exchange, hidden by his horse's neck and the confusion of men watching one another. The revolver cleared leather with a flash of metal. Caleb moved on instinct. He caught Sheriff Harlan's rifle barrel and shoved it down as Lute fired. The shot tore through the fence rail, missing White Hawk by inches. Then the world shattered. Warriors wheeled. Town rifles came up. Horses screamed. Caleb lunged across the dust and slammed into Lute's saddle shoulder first, just as the man cocked for a second shot. Both of them hit the ground hard. Lute's revolver spun away. Caleb drove a forearm into his throat. Lute clawed for the knife at his belt. Caleb trapped the wrist and hammered it once, twice, until bone cracked and the knife fell. Around them, all hell balanced on the edge of a breath. "Hold," White Hawk thundered. "Hold your fire." Sheriff Harlan roared at the same instant. 100 guns trembled between command and panic. Caleb had Lute in the dirt now, one knee on his chest, one hand fisted in his shirt. Lute's eyes bulged with fear and hate. "Do it," Lute rasped. "Go on, Mercer. Prove whose side you're on." Caleb's hand found Lute's revolver in the dust. He brought it up. The barrel pressed against the man's forehead. The valley waited. He thought of Anna, thought of the little grave on the rise, thought of Nanton's eyes in the alley, thought of Storm Runner standing wounded in lantern light, thought of 100 children, settler and Apache both, who would inherit whatever choice he made with that gun. Lute smiled with blood on his teeth. "You ain't clean enough for mercy." "No," Caleb said. Then he lowered the revolver. The disappointment and relief that swept the gathered men were almost equal. Caleb stood and dragged Lute to his feet by the front of his shirt. He shoved him toward the bound prisoners until he nearly fell among them. "No more grave," Caleb said. His voice did not rise. It carried anyway. He faced both lines of men. "These thieves do not hang this morning, not because they deserve kindness, because hanging them between fear and anger would be one more theft, another theft of what law is supposed to be." Lute spat blood. "You talk fancy for a widowed ranch hand." Caleb ignored him. "These men will confess before town and tribe. Every horse stolen, every grave robbed, Every raid disguised as Apache work to stir killing. Every trader cheated. Every settler they led into bushwhacks for profit. They will return what can be returned. Murmurs rolled through the townsmen now, uglier because truth was hitting men who had profited from not seeing. Caleb pointed toward the eastern ridge. Then they will work, not in cells eating beans while others bury the harm. They will work under guard to rebuild spring fences, clear the irrigation ditch near Red Mesa, and deliver 10 head of cattle from Vanna, stock to the widows made hungry by their stealing. Lute barked a laugh. "You can't order my cattle." Caleb turned his eyes on him. "You won't be ordering anything for a long while." Sheriff Harlan found his voice. "Mercer, there's no statute for half that." "Then write one after breakfast." A ripple of startled laughter almost broke from the settlers, then died when they remembered where they stood. Caleb looked to White Hawk. "If you came for blood, this will anger some of your men." "It will," the chief said. "If you came for justice, then stand with me while it's done." White Hawk studied him a long moment. Riders behind him watched with hard, unreadable faces. At last the chief dismounted. He walked through the dust until he stood no more than an arm's length from Caleb. The whole valley watched for the smallest sign. White Hawk drew a knife. Several rifles rose instantly. White Hawk turned the blade and cut the bonds from the prisoners' wrists one by one, not freeing them, changing whose responsibility held them. He handed the rope ends to Caleb. "Then they are yours," he said. The gesture carried farther than speeches ever could. Caleb took the rope. The prisoners looked suddenly less afraid of dying than of what living might cost. White Hawk turned to his warriors and spoke in Apache. The line of riders eased, not relaxed, eased, 1 inch away from the edge. Sheriff Harlan blew air through his mustache and rubbed his brow like a man whose head ached too deep for whiskey. "All right," he said. "All right, we do this clean." He looked at his deputies. "Take every confession. Name every stolen horse. Get the preacher, get the trader ledgers. Get Mrs. Prout down from the North Farm if she can identify the ring." Lute's bravado cracked then. "Sheriff." "Shut up," Harlan said. "I've done too much shutting my own eyes." The morning stretched into work. That was how the killing ended. Not with a charge, not with a duel, with lists. Names, witnesses, men walking fence lines and checking brands, women brought in wagons to identify things buried or sold, a silver ring wrapped in cloth and returned to the son of the woman murdered near Red Mesa, 2 more stolen horses found in a dry canyon under Vanna markings, a ledger from the feed store showing grain bought for stock no one had declared, lies beginning to crumble under daylight. 300 Apache warriors waited through all of it. That waiting alone changed the town. No one could pretend the tribe was a rumor or a faceless threat after that morning. They were fathers on horseback, old men with scars, boys not much older than Nanton sitting straight in saddles, women riding in the rear with eyes that missed nothing. Human beings, dangerous, yes. Wronged, yes. Not shadows to hang every frontier sin upon. By noon, Harlan had enough to jail Lute Vanna and 7 others, enough to seize cattle, enough to strip a rotten man's name from half the power he thought he owned. But law on the frontier moved with one leg shorter than the other. There were cousins, partners, men tied to the Vannas by debt or fear. By evening, whispers began. Mercer had sided with Apache. Mercer had put settlers under a chief's thumb. Mercer had chosen savages over his own. The words reached him while he was repairing his fence rail in the slant light. He repaired it anyway. White Hawk remained at the edge of the ranch until sunset, not near enough to intrude. not far enough to vanish. When the last statement was taken and the prisoners locked in the town jail, he rode to Caleb's gate alone. The valley glowed copper. Wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. "You spared a man who would have killed you," White Hawk said. "I spared the valley his ghost. Ghosts come, whether invited or not." Caleb nodded, still. White Hawk looked toward the town. "Some of my warriors are angry. They wanted blood to answer blood. Some of my townsmen are angry too." The chief almost smiled. "Then perhaps you chose correctly." Caleb leaned against the gate. His bones felt older than they had at sunrise. "Did I?" White Hawk let the question sit between them. Then he said, "A man never knows that on the same day." Nanton rode up from the line behind his father, Storm Runner walking sounder now, bandaged but proud. The boy held out Caleb's revolver and rifle. "We kept them," Nanton said, "so no foolish man could take them before the right time." Caleb took the weapons with a quiet thanks. White Hawk reached into a saddle pouch and drew out something wrapped in buckskin. He handed it across the gate. Inside lay a small carved figure of a horse, simple and strong. "For the return," the chief said. Caleb ran a thumb over the smooth wood. "I didn't do it for reward." "I know." "Then why this?" White Hawk looked to the rise behind the cabin, where Anna's grave stood fenced in white stone. "Because some men live too long hearing only what they failed to save. A gift can remind them what they did not fail." Caleb's throat tightened once, unexpectedly. He closed his hand around the carving. "Thank you," he said. White Hawk gave a single nod. He turned his horse. Then he paused and looked back. "When the spring grass rises," he said, "bring seed corn to Red Mesa. There are families who lost food in the winter. We will trade fair." It was not friendship. On that frontier, it was something harder won and more useful. "I'll come," Caleb said. The chief rode away. Nanton lifted a hand once before following. The 300 warriors withdrew at dusk as quietly as they had come. One ridge emptied, then another, until the land seemed too wide after their leaving. Night settled. Caleb sat on his porch with the carved horse in one hand and Anna's ring in the other. He had worn the ring on a cord around his neck since her death. Some nights he took it out just to feel the circle and remind himself grief had shape. Other nights he left it hidden, afraid of how much memory could still own him. This night he held both, the little wooden horse, the wedding ring. One thing returned, one thing never could be. He heard hooves after dark and expected trouble. What came instead was Sheriff Harlan alone, riding tired. The old lawman tied off at the fence and came to the porch without asking. He removed his hat and stood turning it in both hands. "I come to apologize," he said. Caleb gestured toward the spare chair. "Might as well sit if you're going to do a hard thing." Harlan sat with a groan, harder than chasing drunks. They listened to the spring for a minute. "I kept peace badly," the sheriff said at last. "Thought if I ignored certain men's ugliness, I'd keep a lid on worse ugliness. Turns out rot under the floorboards still brings a house down." Caleb looked into the dark. Most men tell themselves some version of that. "I should have stopped Vanna a year ago." "Yes." Harlan accepted the blow without flinching. "You don't waste words." "No." The sheriff sighed. "Town council wants a hearing in 3 days. They want witnesses from the tribe if they'll come. They want to know whether we make examples or make peace." Caleb said, They want someone else to carry what they're afraid to admit. Probably. Harlan rubbed his knees. Will you stand up there and say what happened? Yes. You know half the valley blames you. Caleb turned the wooden horse in his palm. Then half the valley can learn patience. That did draw a short, tired laugh from the old man. When Harlan left, the stars were out clear and cold. Caleb stayed on the porch until the moon climbed. Then he walked to Anna's grave. The boards around it needed sanding where weather had raised splinters. He knelt and set the carved horse against the stone marker. I did one thing right today, he said into the quiet. Wind moved through the grass. No answer came except the kind a widower learns to take anyway. 3 days later, the hearing filled the town church beyond comfort. The benches held ranchers, wives, laborers, traders, and children peering between sleeves. Men stood in the back with hats in both hands. The Vanner brothers sat shackled under guard. Lute's face had gone puffy and yellow where Caleb's fists had left their truth. He carried himself with the sullen dignity of a man who still believed the world owed him rescue. White Hawk came with 4 elders and Nanton. No more. That alone was a gesture of restraint. They entered under a silence so complete the creak of pew wood sounded loud. Preacher Bell opened with a prayer no one fully listened to. Then the testimony began. It lasted all day. Mrs. Prout identified the silver ring taken from her mother. The trader from Miller's Crossing named the goods that vanished on the road and the marks he later saw on Vanner stock. A ranch hand dismissed months before described false raids staged to blame Apache riders and drive settlers into buying protection from men already behind the thefts. Nanton spoke simply about seeing Storm Runner taken. White Hawk spoke even more simply about what horse theft meant among his people. Not money, not inconvenience. Shame, hunger, danger, insult. When Caleb took the stand, he felt every gaze settle. He told the truth in plain lines, no glory, no excuses. He said he returned the horse because it was stolen. He said he rode unarmed because a loaded rifle would have lied about his purpose before his mouth could speak it. He said the valley stood one bad trigger pull from a week of grave. Councilman Reed, a pinched man whose courage lived mostly in meeting rooms, asked, "And in your judgment, Mr. Mercer, why did the chief bring the prisoners to you rather than demand them?" Caleb looked at White Hawk before he answered. Because he wanted to know if we had any justice in us that wasn't tied to fear. The room took that like a slap. Later Reed asked, "Do you believe mercy toward these men serves the town?" Caleb's eyes drifted toward the Vanners. Mercy is not the word. No, work is. That line carried farther than any speech. In the end, the council chose a sentence no one would have imagined a week earlier. Lute Vanner and his partners were stripped of land claims gained through fraud. Their cattle herds were cut and divided by court order among the families they had cheated and the widows they had harmed. They were placed in labor gangs under armed watch to repair roads, fences, wells, and irrigation cuts for a term of years. The grave robber among them, proven guilty in the old woman's death, was taken to the territorial judge and later hanged by formal law, not mob fury. The rest lived to wake every day inside the consequences they had made. Some called it weak. Most of those changed their tune when spring trade opened at Red Mesa without a raid or a shot. Caleb kept to his ranch through those weeks, though keeping to oneself became harder once a valley decided a man belonged to its story. Boys waved when they rode by now. Women sent pies or jars of preserves and pretended they had merely made too much. The blacksmith repaired Caleb's plow hinge without charging. The preacher stopped by to ask if he might use Caleb's words on justice in a Sunday sermon, and Caleb answered, "Only if you improve them." Not all changed kindly. Men tied to Vanna looked at him with dead eyes. A barn on the south road burned one night, and though no one proved blame, the warning sat plain in the smoke. Twice Caleb found his water gate tampered with. Once he found a dead crow nailed to his fence post. He removed it in silence. Honor did not turn enemies into friends. It merely clarified who they were. Spring came slowly. Snowmelt fattened the creek. Grass pushed green through old brown. Calves dropped in the pastures. The land, which had looked all winter like it might never soften again, began to breathe. When the first cottonwood buds opened, Caleb loaded 2 sacks of seed corn, 3 small casks of coffee, and a crate of tools into his wagon and headed for Red Mesa. He went alone. At the edge of Apache country, he found Nanton waiting on Storm Runner, whole again and shining under the sun. The boy had changed in the weeks since the night behind the saloon. He sat straighter now, less haunted. Perhaps because some promises had held. "My father said you would come," Nanton said. "Your father guesses well." Nanton grinned and turned the horse toward the Mesa Trail. "He says a man who returns one thing usually returns twice." Caleb snorted softly. "Then your father's an optimist." The camp at Red Mesa was smaller than he had imagined that first night. Not poor exactly, but marked by winter, thin children, worn blankets, women mending things too often mended already, men carrying themselves with that careful reserve of people who had learned not to show need before strangers. The trade that day began stiff, formal, measured. By noon it had changed. A widow named Sani brought woven blankets in exchange for coffee. 2 brothers traded cured hides for seed and stayed to help unload tools. An old man with white in his braids repaired Caleb's broken wagon pin and refused payment after learning whose hands had returned Storm Runner's reins. Nanton showed children the carved whistle Caleb had brought him, and by evening laughter drifted among the cooking fires. White Hawk and Caleb walked above camp at sunset. Below them smoke rose blue, horses grazed in the wash. The world looked, for 1 hour, as if men had not worked so hard to divide it. "You have enemies among your own now," White Hawk said. "Yes." "And still you came." "Yes." The chief nodded. "Good." Caleb looked toward the west. "That all the comfort I get." "It is enough." They stood in companionable silence a while. Then White Hawk said, "My people speak of the morning at your ranch. Some say you were foolish, some say brave, most say both. Your people sound like my people." White Hawk almost smiled. "That is why peace is difficult. It must be made from men who resemble one another more than they admit." Caleb's thought of that a long while. Through spring and into summer, small things continued. A trade trail opened between the valley and Red Mesa under agreed terms. The sheriff posted riders at the crossing not to threaten, but to witness fair dealing. 2 settler boys lost in a storm were returned by Apache hunters before midnight, alive and wrapped in spare blankets. Later, when sickness struck 3 lodges near the mesa, medicines came from town without haggling or insult. None of it made a miracle, all of it mattered. Caleb changed too, though he would have denied it if asked plainly. The cabin no longer felt like a place he was merely surviving inside. He repaired the porch roof, whitewashed the inside wall, replanted the kitchen patch Anna once tended. Some evenings Nanton and White Hawk came to trade or talk, and the silence in the house no longer seemed like accusation. Sometimes it was simply rest. One evening in late August, as thunderheads stacked purple over the hills, Nanton found Caleb mending harness by the barn. "My father sent me," the boy said. "That sounds official." "It is," Nanton tried to keep solemn and failed. "There is a council at Red Mesa after harvest. My father asks if you will sit near the fire, not speak for us, just sit." Caleb looked at the leather in his hands. The invitation carried more honor than the boy likely understood. "I'll come," he said. Nanton hesitated. "My father says men may remember fighting longer than peace, so peace must be seen." "That sounds like him." The boy nodded. Then quieter, "I remember too." Caleb set the harness aside. "So do I." Storm wind moved through the yard. The smell of rain came strong. Nanton looked up at him. "Do you still miss her every day?" Caleb knew at once who he meant. "Yes." The boy studied the dust near his boots. "My mother says missing someone and honoring them are not the same burden." Caleb let that settle in him like rain finding dry ground. "She sounds wiser than both of us," he said. That night the storm broke hard over the ranch. Caleb stood in the doorway watching sheets of rain sweep the pasture silver. The carved horse White Hawk had given him sat on the shelf above the hearth. Anna's ring hung beside it now, not hidden under his shirt. Two kinds of memory, grief and grace sharing the same nail. When autumn came, the Harvest Council at Red Mesa lit fires across the basin. Families gathered in circles. Children ran under the stars. Old songs rose and fell in a language Caleb did not know, yet the feeling of them reached him anyhow. White Hawk placed him near the fire as promised. Some elders spoke, some watched. One old woman, wrinkled as dry bark, pressed a bowl of stew into Caleb's hands and nodded as if she had known him 50 years. No grand ceremony followed. No sudden brotherhood, but a place was made for him, and he understood that on the frontier, where suspicion was easier than trust, a place made beside a fire could outweigh medals. On the ride home under a clean October moon, Caleb passed the ridge where the 300 warriors had first appeared around his ranch. He reined in there and looked down across the valley. Town lamps glowed warm in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a fiddle played thin through the dark. The land was still harsh. Men were still men. Greed had not been buried forever. Fear had not ridden off for good. But something had shifted, not because one cowboy had returned a horse, because one act of honor had forced other men to show what lived inside them. Some chose fear, some chose anger, a few chose justice. And once that choice had been seen in daylight, the valley could not wholly return to what it had been before. The first frost came early that year. Caleb rose before dawn, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside with coffee steaming in his hand. The grass shone silver. His breath drifted pale. On the fence rail near Anna's grave sat the carved wooden horse, where he had left it after mending the marker the week before. He walked up the rise and stood there in the cold. Below him, the ranch lay quiet and sound. Beyond it, the valley opened toward Red Mesa. Farther still, the mountains held the sunrise in waiting. He touched the stone once. "For a while," he said softly, "I thought surviving you was the last duty left to me." The frost glittered under the first ash-gray light, but it was. He looked east, where the ridges lived, and the people beyond them were no longer only rumor or memory or fear. A horse had been stolen. A horse had been returned. 300 warriors had ridden to his gate. And because one man had chosen not to answer wrong with another easy wrong, Children now crossed trails that had once meant danger, widows ate through winter, and men who mistook cruelty for strength had learned that justice could outlast them. The sun touched the far line of hills. Warmth moved slowly over the land. Caleb Mercer stood in it with his grief, his scars, and the hard peace he had earned. And for the first time in many seasons, the future did not look like something coming to take from him. It looked like something asking what he would build. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.